Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Waiting for other people to come in. Yours is coming. Some people said they might be a little late today, but we will get started. And before I actually start reading from the Hikmat al-Arshiyya itself, I wanted to read this first paragraph of the first chapter of Christian Jambé's The Act of Being, because I think it really captures in one single paragraph what ultimately, at least from a theological point of view, the primacy of being actually is supposed to mean. This is a very pithy quote. Let me just come to the page. Still people coming in. All right. Christian Jambé, he puts it in one paragraph. I think he nails it very well. This is the chapter 1 of his book, The Witness of the Real. And the first paragraph starts as this. He's quoting from Mulla Sadra's Kitab al-Mashriq. He quotes it. It says, quote, "Is it not enough that your Lord is a witness present in all things?" Unquote. Sadra quotes this verse in the prologue of the Book of Metaphysical Prehensions, and this quote clarifies his conception of his understanding as a whole. God testifies to himself in all his manifestations, which are the existence proceeding from his light and his infinite act of being. In return, the philosopher is the witness of the real, restoring to God the testimony whose source can only be in God, and thus practicing the most authentic shahada. This is a very kind of a visionary re-articulation of what we're about to read in this first two propositions of the wisdom of the throw. So let me just start with that. The first Mashriq, or the first place of illumination, concerning knowledge of God, of his attributes, his names, and his signs. It contains the following principles. First principle, deriving from the divine presence, concerning the divisions of being and the establishment of the primary being. He says, that which exists is either the reality of being or something else. By the reality of being, we mean that which is not mixed with anything but being, whether a generality or a particularity, a limit or a bound, a quiddity, an imperfection or a privation. And this is what is called the necessary being, wajib al-wujud. Therefore, we say that if the reality of being did not exist, then nothing at all would exist. But the consequence of this conditional statement is self-evidently false. Therefore, its premise is likewise false, because we see we are in existence, things exist, we exist, right? As for showing the necessity of the actual existence of this primary being, this is because everything other than this reality of being is either a specific quiddity or a particular being mixed with privation and imperfection. Now, every quiddity other than being itself exists only through being, not by itself. How could it exist without being? For if a quiddity were to be taken by itself, separate from being, that quiddity itself could not even be itself, to say nothing of its being existent. Because to affirm something, in this case, being of something else, in this case, a particular quiddity, already presupposes the establishment and being of that other thing. And that being, if it is anything other than the reality of being, is composed of being per se, or being qua being, al-wujud bima huwa wujud, and of some other particularity. But every particularity other than being is taken by itself non-existent or privative. Thus, every compound of a particular quiddity and being is posterior to the simplicity of being and stands in need of being. So privation or non-being does not enter into the existence and actual occurrence of a thing, although it may enter into its definition and its concept. For to affirm any concept of something and to predicate it of that thing, whether the concept be a quiddity or some other attribute, and whether it be affirmed or denied of something, always presupposes the being of that thing. Our discussion always comes back to being, to wujud. Either there is an infinite regression of predications and subjects, or one arrives in the end at an absolute being unmixed with anything else. Thus, it has become evident that the source of existence of everything that exists is this pure reality of being, unmixed with anything other than being. This reality is not restricted by any definition, limitation, imperfection, contention, potentiality, or quiddity. Nor is it mixed with any generality, whether of genus, species, or differentia, nor with any accident, whether specific or general. For being is prior to all these descriptions that apply to quiddities. And that, capital T, which has no quiddity other than being, is not bound by any generality or specificity. It has no specific difference and no particularity apart from its own essence or self. It has no form, nor has it any agent or end. On the contrary, it is its own form, and that which gives form to everything, because it is the completion of the essence of everything. And it is the completion of everything because its essence is actualized in every respect. No one can describe him or reveal him but he himself. And there is no demonstration of him but his own essence or self. Therefore, he gave witness through his self to himself and to the unicity of his self when he said, God gives witness that there is no God but he. Shahidallah innahu la ilaha illa huwa. For his unity is not the particular unity that is found in an individual of a particular nature, nor is it the generic or specific unity that is found in any general notion or any quiddity. Neither is it the conjunctive unity that is found when a number of things become assembled or unified into a single thing. Nor is it the unity of contiguity found in quantities of measurable things. Nor, as you will learn, is it any of the other relative unities, such as unity by resemblance, homogeneity, analogy, correspondence, reduplication, although certain philosophers like Ibn Kamuna have allowed that. Congruence, or any of the other kinds of unity that are not the true unity. In other words, wahid bila adad, the unity outside or without number. No, his unity is other than these relative ones, unknowable in its innermost core, like his essence may be exalted, except that his unity is the source of all these other unities, just as his being is the source of all other particular beings. Hence, he has no second, or rather, nothing is like it one. Similarly, his unitary knowledge is precisely the reality of that knowledge which is unmixed with any ignorance, so that it is knowledge of all things in every respect, because it is absolute being itself and is the container of all these various contingencies, and that's the reason. So it knows, its knowledge is its being, as it were. So therefore it knows, particulars and universals simultaneously, because everything is contained within that. And the same can be said of all of his attributes of perfection, that is life, power, will, etc., which are likewise one with his essence and being. Principle number 2, principle deriving from the throne, concerning the simplicity of being. And this is one of the most controversial statements that has been misinterpreted again and again. This first paragraph, or the first sentence of this next principle, I'll read the Arabic, where he says, كل ما هو بسيط الحقيقة فهو بوحدته كل الأشياء. All that which is simple in its essential reality is by virtue of its absolute unity, all things. It is deprived of none of those things, except for what is on the order of imperfections, privations, and contingencies. Let me just let these two people in. So let me read this again. This is a absolutely essential key element of this entire book, right? all that which is simple. كل ما هو بسيط الحقيقة, all that which is simple in its essential reality, by virtue of its absolute unity, right? بوحدته, right? Is all things. It is deprived of none of those things except for what is on the order of imperfections, privations, and contingencies. This is a packed argument, but it has many, many subtle nuances that become, in essence, the ontological argument for both the existence of God and as well, but simultaneously for the primacy of being itself and why this is the case. So I'll read it once more. All that which is simple in its essential reality is, by virtue of its absolute unity, all things. It is deprived of none of those things except for what is under order of imperfections, privations, and contingencies. كل ما هو بسيط الحقيقة فهو بوحدته كل الأشياء. For example, taking any particular being A, suppose. You say that A is not B. Now, if that with respect to which A is itself A were exactly the same as that with respect to which A is not B, so that A in itself would of its very essence be the criterion for this negation, if this were so, then the very essence of A would be something privative, such that everyone who intellected A would also simultaneously intellect not B. But this consequent is obviously false, and its antecedent is also false. Thus, it is established that in any particular being A, the substrate of A-ness is something essentially compound of being and a particular quiddity. And even according to the mind, that is at the level of mental conceptual being, the notion of A-ness is a compound composed of the notion of something having being by which A exists, and the notion of the privation of something by which A is not B, nor any of the other things that are negated of it. And as I put in the Telegram group, I have reduced this all to a simple formula. I'll read these next two paragraphs and then I will read this formula. Thus, it is known that everything of which that has being may be negated is not absolutely simple in its essential reality. And the converse is likewise true. All that which is simple in its essential reality can have nothing that has been negated of it. Otherwise, it would not be simple in its essential reality, but rather composed of two aspects: an aspect by which it is such as A, and an aspect by which it is some other way, that is, not B, not C, and so on. So now it has been established that the simple being in all existing things with respect to their being and perfection, but not with respect to their privations and imperfections. This is a subtle argument, but it is an absolute key to understanding what this primacy of being means. And by this, it is established that his knowledge of all existent things is simple knowledge, or, if we take the word basit, which Mulla Sadra is using, basit also means expanded, right? From it comes from basit. So basit is both simple and expanded, it's a synonym for the word mohit, right? And by this, it is established that his knowledge of all things is simple, expanded knowledge, and that their presence in him is simple, expanded in its essential reality. For all things in him are included in his knowledge in a higher and more perfect way, since knowledge is only an expression for being. This is a very subtle and important point, on the condition that it be unmixed with matter. So understand this, my beloved, and profit by it. So the formula of what Mulla Sadra is trying to say here. So when we observe specific existences, such as the sky and the earth, we see that there is an existence like the sky, for instance. The existence has a limit, and from its limit, an essence is derived, which is the essence of the sky, its quiddity. So if we take the totality of existence, right, and within this totality, then certain particularities can begin to emerge. These particularities become limits to that absolute, to the flow of that absolute existence, or we take the word instantiation, right? But this instantiation is a limit to that absolute being or that absolute existence. And this is the quiddity, right? Thus, three things are observed: the existence, its limit, and the essence derived from that limit. Therefore, the observed breaks down into three things: the actual reality of existence, the limit of that existence denoting the absence of that ultimate level of the reality of existence confirmed for another level. And three, the essence derived from that specific, which forms the basis for the specific existence as an existence, and thus is its quiddity, distinguishing it from other things. Now, the word quiddity in Arabic is mahia, which also means what is it? All right, or what is she, rather, since it's the pronoun is here. Or you could also say mahua, but mahia is the usual way to say it. So a mahia, or a quiddity, is the suchness of any given thing, right? Now there's a debate, and Sabzavari also makes this distinction himself several times, but in a shorthand way, to say quiddity is to say essence, right? Particularized essence. So this is what, in a sense, Ibn Arabi meant by the immutable archetypal essence of something, the ayn al-thabita that we read about in the Fusus al-Hikam, except with Ibn Arabi, it's a lot more complex a notion and less peripatetic and Avicenna in the way that Mulla Sadra is articulating it, right? So, although I think we won't read every single part of Sabzavari for the remainder of our course, because then we would spend a long time reading. But I thought for this third course, these first two chapters, or at least the first chapter, and then the headings of the second, are quite apropos. So I will read this first chapter and then just read the summaries for the chapter 2, because this is a gloss on what Mulla Sadra just said. So Sabzavari begins by saying all defining terms of existence are but explanations of the word that can neither be a definition nor a description. This chapter is concerned with self-evident nature of existence. It explains how existence defies real definition, and how all that has been said about it by way of definition is nothing but literal definition, i.e. explication of the word meaning. So he says, all so-called defining terms of the existence, like, for example, self-subsistence, qayyum, or that which allows a predication, etc., are but explanations of the word. So many answers given to the question concerning the lexical explanation of the word. This is the kind of thing which is called in Persian, an answer to the first, the most elementary preliminary question concerning the meaning of a word. The Sheikh al-Rais Ibn Sina states in Kitab al-Najat, existence can only possibly be explicated except lexically, because it is the primary primitive principle for all explications. So it itself does not allow of any explication. Rather, its essential form is in the mind without the mediation of anything else. So Ibn Sina's definition is that wujud is amr itibari. It's a conventional, sort of a kind of a accepted consensus reality. And this is where then he subscribes to the primacy of being, Ibn Sina, but then calls it a accident, an araz, rather than a essential primacy on an ontological level. Then Sabzavari goes on, so the so-called definitions can neither be a definition in view of the fact that existence is absolutely simple, having neither specific difference nor genus, as we shall see presently, nor can it be a description, because a description is obtainable only by an accidental property, which is part of the five universals. And if those of you who don't know what the five universals are, the five universals are genus, species, differentia, property, and accident. Right? So the so-called definition can neither be a definition of the view of the fact that existence is absolutely simple, having neither the specific difference nor genus, as we shall see presently, nor can it be a description, because a description is obtainable only by an accidental property, which is part of the five universals, whose division itself is based on the thingness of quiddity, while existence and its properties derived from an entirely different source from quiddity. Okay, all of this is trying to tell us that we cannot conceptualize being as a thing, and this has been the problem with much of philosophy, even from Aristotle, in the way that he contextualized the question. Because in book Gamma of the Metaphysics, the way that Aristotle defines being is the being qua being. And his explication of what that means ends up as being an explication of the existent as the existent. So all of these various peripatetics, and especially Islamic philosophers, have dealt with this question as a form of saying we are investigating the nature of equidity. So an existence, existent qua existent, rather than existence qua existence, because this existence qua existence then establishes the primacy of being, which then cannot be defined at all, right? So in a sense, what Mulla Sadra and Sabzavari are trying to do are raising the bar on what Book Gamma of Aristotle's metaphysics tried to define as a definition of existence or being. He goes on. Furthermore, a defining term must always be more immediately known and clearer than the defined term. But nothing is more evident than existence, because it's both not a thing and it's also in front of us simultaneously. We exist, everything exists, we are in existence, right? Even if the existence is an illusion, there is still an existence, right? But this existence is not a thing, okay? So we cannot define it as a thing. So none of these predicables can possibly apply to the definition of real being. Its notion is one of the best known things, but its deepest reality is in the extremity of hiddenness. Its notion, the notion of existence, is one of the best known things, but its deeper reality, the single luminous reality whose mode of being, as required by its essence, is the refusal of non-existence. And being the prime source of all the effects that are to be expected from the existent things, and for which that self-evident notion is the formal mark, is in the extremity of hiddenness, right? It is the most evident, but by nature of its absolute evidence, it is indefinable. So it is simultaneously occurring in the extremity of the hidden as well, right? Al-Zahir al-Batin, manifest and the hidden. In this verse, the author has harmonized the thesis of those who assert that the notion of existence is self-evident, and of those who hold the most fundamental reality of existence is absolutely inconceivable. The latter thesis is based on the argument that if its reality of existence were actualized in the mind, the result would be one, that its effect would be actualized externally, but if so, such an effect would not have been actual at all in the mind. This is the case because a mental existence does not produce the external kind of effects which are to be expected of it, or that it would not be followed by the actualization of its effects. But in that case, it would not be existence in the real sense of the word, existence being the very source of presupposed by all its effects. In addition, when anything becomes imprinted in its reality, in the mind, its quiddity must necessarily remain intact, however much its accidental features related to its existence may change. But the existence, the absolute being itself, has no quiddity. If there were to be quiddity to it, its quiddity by which existence would be existent would imply to be the very reality of existence itself. So there can be no existence as something additional to the quiddity in such a way that it could leave the latter as something which would continue to remain intact in the mind. All right? So this is the reason why we cannot conceive of the existence of God, is because the mind, right, or the itibar, that which creates conventions in the mind, can only intellect things, right? But existence is not a thing. It is both act and beyond it simultaneously, so we can't define it. And then in the remaining propositions of chapter 2, existence is fundamentally real. He says, existence, in our opinion, is fundamentally real. The arguments of our opponents is invalid, meaning the arguments of the essentiality of quiddity. And although Suhrawardi doesn't actually use the term asalat al-mahiyya, the the primacy of quiddity, yet the argumentation that he makes is essentially that in his Kitabik method is strong. But with several different caveats that Sabzavari kind of points out, and Mulla Sadra had also pointed this out in several places, including in his own commentary on Sohrawardi's philosophy of illumination, that the way that Sohrawardi is dealing with the question is a little bit, he hasn't quite gotten his terminology and his argumentation right, because that which he attributes as the light of lights, from which all the quiddities emerge, is just another way of saying being. But for some reason, because of the kind of, not satisfactory definition of being that we have in Avicenna and the Peripatetics, sort of why they overturn the apple cart on the peripatetic notion of being from Avicenna as being an accident, although primary. And so he opted for the primacy of quiddity. But then the primacy of quiddity with Sohrawardi itself becomes a very problematic thing, because he is not necessarily saying that the light of lights is a quiddity, right? He's saying that the light of lights transcends even the notion of quiddity. So what Sabzavari is arguing is that then why belabor the point and call the mahia or the quiddity to be primary, when the light of lights itself is not a quiddity. It's not it is an essence that is existence itself, such that light is existence. So these were the problems, some of the problems that are implied in Shahabuddin, and he kind of demonstrates this by then saying, because existence is the source of all values or source of all things, where he then explains the self-evidence of existence. Then he has the section, the distinction between the two modes of being fully suffices. Then he goes on to say, we hold the necessary existence of priority in causal relationship, where there can be no order with regard to quiddity. And he's right about that. So what he's saying is, which is the implied argument that Mulla Sadra kind of put in the first proposition, is that if something exists and if the quiddity is primary, then what makes that quiddity to be is the question. And so this puts carts before the horse if we then assert the primacy of the quiddity. So therefore, existence has to be primary, from which the quiddity or the essences emerge. So Sabzavari here in this proposition of the second chapter, and goes on to establish why that is the case. And he goes on to say, what brings to light our contention is the existence of degrees in the gradual increase of intensity constituting various species. So rather than argue about this infinite regress of quiddities being primary, right? The issue is being is primary, but within being there are gradations or levels. The way that Mulla Sadra phrases, there is tashkik. There are levels of the articulations of being, right? But even still, then this makes being or existence would droop the primary substrate or the primary thing, whose primacy, which is basically God. Then he has one section where he talks about how can it be otherwise, since by being all things have left the state of equality, and he explains to us, he goes on about how the relationship of things to the maker is. Then the next section after that, if existence were not fundamentally real, there would be no unity actualized. All the things raise only the dust of multiplicity. He's spot on about this. The truth on his words would not be unified except by that which unity always goes hand in hand, right? If we hold the primacy of essence or primacy of quiddity, then this creates insoluble problems around the question of the unicity of God, right? Mulla Sadra solves this question beginning with his first proposition. And in the second proposition, he basically augments and demonstrates what this was, which is a little bit confusing the way that he's written it, but in the formula that I have, it kind of, basically establishes what he's trying to say. So that if we talk about the unicity of God can only be accepted in the philosophical formulation of that question if we take being, existence as being the primary thing, and that being primary universally is God itself. And that was a summary of the Sharh Manzumeh, and then before that we did the Wisdom of the Throne. But this key argument that he puts in the second principle, Mulla Sadra puts in the second principle of his Wisdom of the Throne, all that which is simple in its essential reality is by virtue of its absolute unity, all things. This is the key to understand what is being meant by the primacy of being. So if you take this statement as it is, which many of the mutakallimun, especially amongst the Shia, have misinterpreted repeatedly, and even now it's the one sentence from the entirety of the philosophy of Mulla Sadra that is always taken out of context, and he's accused of being a pantheist. What he's saying is that, and he qualifies this towards the end of that section. Yes, from one angle, we can say the simplicity or the extension, which is also another word for basit, is all things, but not any one of them, right? But not in their privations, not in their perfections, right? Which then puts every existent in a very interesting situation. It puts every existence in the situation of both being a negative or a privative or a negated reality, as well as simultaneously a positive or isbati reality in relation to this basit al-haqiqa, this simple expanded reality, which is all things, right? Now, why the theologians would have a problem with this, there are many reasons for it. Many of it is linguistic. The linguistic being is that if we're asserting that God is exalted and transcendent and, sanctified beyond all things, then we cannot assert that God is all things. But yet, if God is being simultaneously asserted in the Quran as being closer to things than their jugular vein, right? Then this principle simultaneously holds, because God is presence, and by being in things, we're not talking about a material or substantial entry. We're talking about presence, right? And Mulla Sadra, in the very last paragraph of the second proposition, has qualified what he means, that all that which is simple in its essential reality is by virtue of his absolute unity, all things. He says, and by that it is established that his knowledge of all existent things is simple or expanded knowledge, and their presence in him is simple in its or expanded in its essential reality. For all things in him are inclined in his knowledge in a higher and more perfect way, since knowledge is only an expression of being, a condition that is unmixed with matter. So that is basically the very basic argument that we have for the primacy of being and what the relationship of quiddity is, and why quiddity cannot be primary in this scheme of Tawheed, because otherwise it compromises the scheme of Tawheed completely. And on this, Mulla Sadra is 100% correct, in my opinion. And I think some of the argumentation, even though his language is sometimes over-rationalist and he's using Aristotelian categories and that not, nevertheless, the gist of the argument in its nuances, just a sec. For this, come back on. What happened? Can everybody hear me? Okay. So basically the argument is that we can, the primacy of being is the correct philosophical approach to the question of Tawheed. And if we take quiddity as being primary, then this compromises the whole entire scheme of Tawheed, because quiddity also, if you break it down, quiddity is composed of two things. Quiddity by itself without existent is non-existent. But quiddity is composed of existence and the essence, which makes it, right? Or as the way they would put it in the Hosa, It is the dhat and the sifat that constitute that quiddity, the ipseity or the essence of that thing, and then the attribute. And that is what distinguishes it from other things. Everyone is unique. Every quiddity is, as it were, its own signature. So we can say that every quiddity is an or it's an instantiation of the signature of being, but it's not the totality, or it's not the simplicity or expanded simplicity of being. And so I'll leave it here and open the floor to anybody who wants to interrogate this concept further. Go for it.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so this question of existent qua existent versus existent qua existence, does this sort of poke a hole at the foundation of, like, say, Anselm's ontological argument, where he sort of conceives of a thing and he says, "Oh, it must have being," as if being is just some sort of property. Right?
In one sense it does, but in another sense it doesn't. And this is what Mulla Sadra was criticizing in that first proposition, is that the problem with this concept amongst a lot of these philosophers, and it's just not just with the Christian medieval philosophers like Anselm, but also this was a problem with a lot of the Islamic philosophers, never mind the theologians, that however they're defining it, they're still defining existence as a thing, even though an abstraction, but still a particular thing, right? Rather than, not just even from the point of view of a universal, but from the point of view that it is the totality and beyond. It is that which makes things be, the actus essendi. This issue of the actus essendi was not properly dealt with, even though they had the concept down to some degree, all of these guys, whether from the Islamic tradition or the Christian medieval West, etc., they couldn't quite get it, right? But what Mulla Sadra and what Sabzavari glosses are really refining this, right? And rather than arbitrarily say, well, we can't define being, so we can't talk about it, they're demonstrating why that is the case, why you cannot actually define the act of existence, the esto, the wujud. It's just impossible to define, but yet it is the most self-evident thing, right? So we will, for the sake of argument, we will establish this as the first principle or the first axiom, with the understanding that we can't define it. But then from this indefinable, all things emerge, right? And existent is existent by virtue of existence. This is the self-evident truth, right? So to say that a quiddity or an essence brings it into being is also then to predicate existence to that being. But then that also again begs the question, so therefore either we have a single existence universally that is responsible for the existentiation of each particular thing, right? Or the other position, which Sabzavari highlighted, our opponent's argument is invalid, becomes the case, where they, assert the primacy of the quiddity or the essence, rather than the existence itself. It's a fine argument. I understand this, but it's the only argument that really makes any sense. When we're talking about God's relation to the world, the primacy of being is the only one that makes sense. And if you've been looking at Ahsai tries to extract his own philosophizing from Mulla Sadra, but it's even in that Fawaid al-Hikmiyah, the way that he's defining his terms and talking about God is from the position of the primacy of being. Except he says something that Sabzavari very implicitly criticizes, but I think Sabzavari is not really looking at the fine line. Ahsai, in the very, like the third chapter of his Fawaid al-Hikmiyah, makes a beautiful assertion. He says that On the one hand, we can talk about God as the absolute being, but on the other hand, we can look at God as the Lord of being, right? And what is being and what is essence? And he says that, existence or wujud is that which looks upon its Lord, while essence is that which looks upon itself. It's a beautiful argument. But he also holds, which is what Sabzavari is not really understanding, that he says that in the mind of God, these two are coextensive with each other, right? Which is not something that Mulla Sadra or Sabzavari would necessarily disagree with, except because they are trying to push a logical primacy as an axiom, right? They would have a problem in terms of a temporal procession between existence and essence in the way that Al-Asai is phrasing it. But I don't have a problem with Asai's argument. I think Asai's argument is actually spot on, and it also resolves certain opacities about Mulla Sadra himself. So we can say, that which looks upon its Lord, which here stands for being, right, has this coextensive unus ambo relationship with essence or quiddity, which looks upon itself. And this becomes a very powerful, in my opinion, a lot more powerful meditative kind of symbol about the relationship between existence and essence, right? Which means that essence or a quiddity that looks upon itself ultimately ruptures into existence. So if you take the hadith, man arafa nafsi faqad arafa rabbahu, whosoever knows themselves knows their Lord, by Asai positing that quiddity looks upon itself while existence looks upon its Lord, then the rupture of essence is always towards being, which then, in a kind of a looping kind of argument, reestablishes the primacy of being, and what then essence or quiddity represents in this scheme of things.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Sidi, following up, would it be correct if we rephrase the words of Sheikh Aksai in the following manner, that everything besides God, the pure existence, has two aspects, wujud and mahiyya, where the wujud, it is the non-created aspect of the being, which gives us unity with God, or wahdatul wujud in terms of Ibn Arabi, and mahiyya, it is created, the created aspects, which makes the thing specific.
This is actually exactly what Mulla Sadra himself says in the first volume, the first journey of the Asfar. This is how he himself defines all of this, right? So, yes, we can define it that because that's what Mulla Sadra himself does. So, this is what I find interesting about Asai, is that Asai is actually re-articulating a very important segment of an argument by Mulla Sadra himself, but in a much more kind of a visionary kind of way, about the same thing. Because that which looks upon its Lord must by definition come first before that which looks upon itself, because there is no self without the Lord, right? But this is also implied in a kind of a roundabout sort of way, in the way that Asai himself is phrasing this thing, right? So, the Lord is the primacy, which makes it the being. So if existence is looking upon its Lord, then existence is the mirror of its Lord, which means that existence is primary. Now, we can hear kind of quibble as Asai does, but Mulla Sadra also answers that Mulla Sadra has different ways of talking about the levels of God. So when he's just like Ibn Arabi, wujud al-mutlaq is at the level of the emergence of the names and attributes. So the wujud al-mutlaq is at the level of the wahidiyah, whereas the ahadiyah is a much, it's beyond even the wujud al-mutlaq, the way that Ibn Arabi defines it. Mulla Sadra coins the term wujud al-haq. And whenever he's talking about wujud al-haq, he's talking about that absolute existence that even transcends the absolute existence, right? But what Asai is trying to do, because he had such a problem from a linguistic level of equating any level of God with creation, right? That, he would say these things. But like I said, he also then ends up in exactly the same place, because once you're dealing with these categories, when you're properly interrogating it, you cannot end up at the same place. And that's what happens to Asai. He ends up, but just rephrases it and puts his emphasis linguistically on certain elements of the problem. But Mullah Sadra or even Adavi would have no problem with that, with the way that Asai has articulated that, because just remember from our readings in the Fusus al-Hikam, the Wujud al-Mutlaq is responsible at that level of the Wahidiyah for the generation of the Ayana Thabita. And then he says simultaneously, but they have not whiffed from the taste of existence. They don't even exist. They are these intelligibles in the mind of God that are occurring in this no man's land between existence and non-existence.
And that would be because one of the explanation of Mahiyya, for example, in Bidayatul Hikmah of Tabatabai, exactly that Mahiyya taken by itself, it is neither existing nor not existing.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's the intermediate state, which is Ariana Thabita in
Yeah.
the.
Okay.
uh,
Let me read to you. I'll read from the second chapter of my own Effulgences of Wisdom. This is how I resolved this problem. It's about, what is it? It's only 2 paragraphs. I say, this is on page 72 of my own Effulgences of Wisdom. I say that the quidification of any quiddity mahia in its quidicity is merely the movement of the light of being itself in that given quiddity, such that it may be said from one perspective that the reflections produced by the movement of the light of being are what originate the instance of each particular quiddity, hence making of any quiddity or essence a captured instance, as it were, within the totality of things, which is the singular luminosity of being's light in its movement. In that regard, Sopa Azal, upon him being the light, openly alludes to the reality of the situation when he states, I be his locution, that God created everything for the light of its essence. This is one meaning to existence, wujud, looking upon its Lord, whilst essence, ain mahia, looks upon itself. Since the light of being beholds itself in totality, perceiving that which illuminate its being as its Lord, the absolute existence, wujud mutlaq, which it looks upon in comprehensive totality, whereas the essence perceived itself only in its luminance instance as itself, even though it itself is a mere moment of the totality in the movement of the light of being itself. Therefore, were essence to look further beyond its own particular suchness, it would properly perceive that it has not even whiffed from the taste of independent existence, that it is merely a particle and instance of that existential light, forever contemplating its Lord, who is the absolute being of the truly real, that already always emits the light of itself to itself from itself, wherein the light of being, as it were, is merely the shadow of the absolute being of the truly real, without delimitation, who is seeking to know itself. In this way, the light of being can be seen as the shadow of the absolute being, just as quiddity is the shadow of the light of being. And this is my resolution to this classical problem, without necessarily compromising either what Mulla Sadra is saying or the way that Al-Ahsai, quibbling with him, is trying to rephrase the same argument and ending up basically in the same place simultaneously.
Thank you very much, Sid.
I have a question.
Go for
So I've been well aware that Einstein's Big Bang, or the Big Bang that came from Einstein's work, has been debunked.
it.
That there was something before the Big Bang, and I mean, intuitively, it's just, there's the something from nothing argument. It's very difficult. And so trying to get my head around this idea of God as separate from time, because time gives things the beginning, of when. So something has to have a starting point. So I'm aware of this, that God is supposed to be, my understanding of it within Islam is that, God is what is independent of the creation.
Yeah.
So doesn't depend on it, but the creation depends on it. At what point do you feel there's a strong enough sort of encouragement to just go to the puny human mind can't understand it within the I'd say starting with the Quran itself rather than what came after that. Do you feel that there is there's an emphasis on that, and that's, I mean, obviously we can't push what we don't understand anyway, or not.
Well, what do you mean by understand? Do you mean rationalizing it or intuiting it? Because first of all, there's two different understanding. Where time is concerned, I mean, the way that Plato phrases it is probably the classic definition of what is time. He says that time is the moving image of eternity, right? Then there is that great hadith Qudsi that I have quoted many, many, many times. La tasabu al-dah, fa inna Allahu ad-dah. Do not inveigh against the time or the durationless time, because verily God is the durationless time. Right?
Yes.
So time, God is outside of time, but God is simultaneously within time because time it is basically an emanation of God or a self-disclosure of God. Every instance is God. Right? But this is not something that you arrive by scientific rationalist demonstration, right?
Well, no, yes. So I guess you've clarified my question, which is there a path to it intuitively beyond the rational, or is there an acceptance that you just have to stop there?
Of
even
course,
intuitively.
This is what these these sapiential initiatic paths are all about. To open those pathways beyond the ratiocinative intellect, or what Plato defined as the three forms of knowing. Doxa, which is the opinion, general, masses, majority of human beings form their notions and ideas about the world based on opinion. Then there's the ratio. There is the intellection, the mind, reasoning, right, based on axioms and syllogisms and premises, etc. And then there's a higher, beyond all of that. That is the noesis. That is intuitive, and it does not necessarily reject ratio or the ratiocinative intellect, but it is beyond it. It is a super intellectual approach, or what the imams mean by the notion of aql, the higher intelligence, or as Idris renders as nexal consciousness.
Yeah, because it feels like people, gnosis-wise, can grasp all these different quantum dimensional layers and, aspects of time, but no one's going to get outside of time itself.
Well,
so, I don't know. Has anyone done that?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of no quiddity, no essence, no individuated instance can get out of time. But then from another angle, if time is God, or at least if time is a self-disclosure of God, then you are already always both inside and outside of it. Especially if it's a moving image of eternity, you are both contained by it and also transcended simultaneously. So the point of a spiritual path is the ability to start at least within the internal world, to break these boundaries. These are the boundaries that keep you locked in the movement of time. or what is produced as the accidents in the material world of the movement of time. Because the more that you are aware of this noetic reality, the less these accidents, these aras, have effect. So this is one of the purposes of a spiritual path. And this all comes with actual realization of the contents of that noetic knowledge.
Can God really be defined as independent of creation if time and memory seem to be, I mean, they work together to build complexity, and evolution over time? You can see that everything's become more complex in its consciousness, theoretically. So if that's God seeking to know itself, then does not God then depend on the creation somehow?
At one level, yes, but on another level, no. Just remember, we're not talking about a single level of this absolute being. So this level that is seeking to know itself is at the level of manifestation. But then there is the level of the hidden treasure itself, which is beyond even the desire to know.
Yeah. So we can really only see the clues of it at this level where we are mostly intellectually, I guess. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Cool. Say,
I was reading. I went back and I didn't read the primary source of the Fawaid al-Hikmah, but I was reading Idris's exposition of it. So I was full of like all this stuff to say about Ahsa'i, but you've addressed so much of it. I still have a question. I mean, I guess I'm not completely convinced that they're saying the same thing. So I'm trying to think of how to put it. For Sheikh Ahmed, it's that existence and essence exist. They're correlational.
Yeah.
So I think even the idea of pure existence or absolute existence, he uses the term.
yes.
But like Idris explains, when he uses the term absolute existence, it's a shorthand for a reference to what is actually a dialectical composite.
Yes. Of essence, existence, of wujud and ain. Yeah.
Yeah. So for Ihsa'i, God is the only simple thing.
Yes.
Not.
He's also from Mulla
Which
Sadra.
is.
He's, Asai also uses the same term, the basit al-haqiqa, in that I think it's in the second chapter, the second observation. He uses that exact same term that Mulla Sadra uses in the Arshia. So
Okay, well then.
Yeah, go ahead.
But then I would question if. So when I was reading Mulla Sadra and Sabzabari, I was thinking that they were referring to wujud al-mutlaq. They're not referring to what Mulla Sadra calls wujud al-haq when they say all of these things and talk about the simplicity. Like in Sabzabari on the part that I don't think that it's the part that you read, but he says that one of the issues that he has is what is he saying? If both quiddity and existence were real, then there would be even the first emanation would be composite. So he seems to have an issue.
I don't see that argument, and I think that he doesn't really. I don't know why he throws that in there, because we can have existence and essence as a simultaneity without there being any compoundness, because especially we're talking about levels that are beyond the material. So I don't understand why he throws that argument in there, because this is not something even that Mulla Sadra would necessarily agree with. That you can have these simultaneities without there any question of compoundness or compositeness even coming into the discussion. It's just what is the temporal succession in the simultaneity? What comes first? Is it the existence or the essence? Asai has no problem in detailing that. He says that, obviously the existence comes first, then the essence and the temporal, but they're coexistent, they're simultaneous. So Mulla Sadra would have absolutely no problem at all with the way that Asai has phrased that. But Sabzavari does, and I don't quite understand why. I've asked this question of some of these Hozavis several times, and I've never gotten a satisfactory answer from any of them. Why would Sabzavari even say this? And what is his demonstration based on it? Because it's like he's just throwing that in there, kind of like a reactive argument against Sheikh Ahmad Asai. Although Mulla Sadra is essentially saying the same thing in the very first volume of the Asfar, when he's arguing about the primacy of being. It's just the issue of what is the temporal succession. Is it existence, the universal, or is it the quiddity that comes first? Asai answers that perfectly. Existence comes first, and so does Mulla Sadra. So then why say that which Sabzavari? I've never understood why Sabzavari says this. It's like a unnecessary argument, because all the way up to that point, his arguments are sound. He just throws that sentence in there and it's like, well, why are you saying this? Because we're not even talking about, that issue of compoundness only applies to the levels beyond. If you're talking from the point of view of the abstract realms, this is not relevant. You can have an essence that is not concrete. It's just an instantiation. I mean, even Arabi has no problem with this argument when he's talking about the Ayana Thabit. So why does Sabzavari? I've never understood this about Sabzavari.
Yeah, I mean, it seems this whole second chapter he just skips Sheikh Ahmad's position. He presents it as these two possibilities: the only existence exists and only essence exists. But Sheikh Ahmad has a kind of middle position between those two.
Yes.
So it seems like he's just not addressing, throughout that whole discussion, he's not addressing that position. Okay, so when Mulla Sadra is talking about the simple existence, he's talking about, I'm still not clear, he is talking about wujud al-haq?
No, he's talking about wujud al-mutlaq. He's talking about that level of the wahidiyah. So one good thing that Ahsai does in the observations of wisdom is that, I think it's in the third or it's probably still in the second observation, he equates the basit al-haqiqah, the simple reality, with the will. Right? So once that's done, then it is talking about the wujud al-mutlaq and not about the wujud al-haq. And for Mulla Sadra himself, with these first two propositions, he's attempting to first establish the axiom. So if we are to schematize the level at which he's talking, he's not talking about the hidden treasure. He's talking about those first emanations of that wujud al-haq, that hidden treasure.
Okay, so I'll have to go back and see and read that observation. But in the part by Idris that I was reading, I didn't see Ahsai call it simple, because for him it's the only simple reality is the transcendent. And there's the way he puts it, Idris puts it, is that at the level of the will, there's a subtle duality. It's like very subtle. It's almost like perfectly simple, but there is a compositeness even in the will, because he calls it the al-umuq al-akbar. The great abyss is the essential aspect of the will. There's an active and a responsive, receptive. So even at the level of the will for Ahsai, there is a little bit of compositeness.
Which is the same for Ibn Arabi, because this is the level at which all the names and attributes emerge. This is the origin of the duality of things. But to call it murakkab, I think is the wrong term to use, right? Probably a better term would be a mushakkak, kind of the taking it from the tashkik, that there is these, these separativeness or gradations, which is what happens at the level of names of attributes, which is the Wahidiyya. So I think this is where Sabzavari, in a sense, is kind of struggling in understanding at least Asai's argument, because that's not what Asai is arguing. He's not arguing that that these things are compound, or even in a subtle way. He's basically implying, even with the language that he uses, that they are distinct, right? So in that distinction, that absolute total simplicity is now different. It is not completely that of the hidden treasure, right? But we can still call it the Basit al-Haqiq and apply it to the level of the will, right? So the level of the Wujud al-Haq would, in a sense, with Asai, would even transcend any notion of Basitiyya. It is so simple that it is even beyond that. And so that is probably the reason why we should more correctly apply that kind of simplicity or that expansiveness to the level of the Wahidiyya, where the will is, and where the names and attributes come from. First and worst.
Another angle that I was using to look at this was just the idea of aql, because for Mulla Sadra, it seems that wujud is aql, and that whole discussion of the unitary knowledge, the knowing of all things, because it is all things. But I was thinking of, so in Sheikh Ahmed, because he admits that there is this very subtle, we can call it tashkik, ambiguity in the will. There's, I think he would say that it's aql and jahal. I was thinking about the hadith of aql and jahal and how Mulla Sadra would deal with it. I don't know how he would deal with it, but in Sheikh Ahmed, I think it's really clear. He would say, well, because there's that within the will, there's that ambiguity. God created both, right? In the hadith,
I would even rephrase it this way: the Mashiach itself contains no jah. It is at the level which then the Mashiach instantiates into the irada that we can then now properly talk about this distinction between aql and jah. Why? Because the level of the universal will is just throwing out everything without any discrimination. It is the level of the volition where these where these instantiations are occurring of that universal will, such that something is something as opposed to not something else. So that then we can hold this affirmative, negating relationship in relation to a thing and its relation to other things. So that would be the level of the irada, which is still going on within that realm of the Wahidiyya itself, such that then, we have these relationships between the names, the name of, the Basit and Qabis, Rahman and, Qahar or Jabbar, whichever, these contraries. So this polarity occurs on that level, whereas the Mashiach is just throwing everything out indiscriminately out of itself. And it's then the volition that is particularizing all things as distinct from one another, and where the names actually start to gain their differentia between each other. Anybody else?
Would the act of kun, would that be this, undifferentiated spray of creation? So there's no, each species and genus or whatever is something that comes much later.
That comes immediately in the next level. So you take that verse from the Quran, whenever it says to anything, kun fayakun, be and it is, the kun would be the will, and fayakun, and it is, would be the volition.
Another question. in the hidden treasure, the Nur Muhammad, is a desire to disclose more transcendent than the desire to know.
Say that, rephrase that again.
Is the desire to disclose more transcendent than the desire to know?
Well,
Or are they similar, the same?
well, this is something that Neoplatonism has had a real problem with, because Plotinus would say the one does not know at all. It just pours out of itself, right? But in this context, and especially with Mulla Sadra, who was working with the Imami Hadiths, knowledge and power are the two primary attributes of the Godhead, out of which every other attribute emerges: power and knowledge. So on the one hand, there's the hidden treasure in its concealment, in its hidden ipseity, right? And then it is the desire to know, which emerges from the power and knowledge of God, to know, right? So the self-disclosure here would be a function of this power and knowledge.
That's the expression of it.
Yeah.
And is that like a spontaneous, intuitive kind of convulsion or something? Or
Well, I mean, there's different ways that this has been phrased, but if we take the concept of I, right, the minute that we posit I, right, we are positing an I in relation to something else. Okay? And so once that occurs, then that I wishes to know either what its I is or what the eyes of others are. So when you take the hadith of the hidden treasure, in the way that the Akbarian tradition has glossed this in infinite different ways, they've commented on this hadith, beginning with Ibn Arabi. The minute that God says I, kuntu kanzan, I was a hidden treasure, the minute this is uttered, it wishes to then know itself in these infinite expressions of itself that then occur as the creation of the world. This incessant, and the way that Qurban deals with this question in his creative imagination, the Sufism of Ibn Arabi is absolutely gorgeous, and he's quoting from different authors, where he says that that melancholia and just that pathos in the true original definition of that word is something that all creation feels, because that is the pathos of God itself. God, the hidden treasure, can never exhaust its knowledge of itself because it's infinite. So this is where the melancholia and the pathos of creation occurs, and that is one of the signs of God. That pathos, that melancholic pathos that every creation, deep down feels, that is actually the sign of God itself, seeking to know itself and incapable of exhausting its knowledge of itself. Because knowledge of something, and especially when we're talking at the level of the Godhead, would imply a denotation of the exhaustion of that knowledge, to coming to know this thing itself in its totality, in every facet, since, as Mulla Sadra just told us, knowledge is being, right? But being is infinite as axiom, as are the contents that being throws out, being infinite. And therein is the paradox.
so is the pathos then like an existential incomprehension?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Good thing. Anyone else?
I will proceed with one more here about simplicity. نسيت الحقيقة. Because this was a problem when I read Suhrawardi's Hayaki Nur, that what is exactly the interaction between the things which are thabit, which are constant, and between the other things which are hadith, which are constantly emerging and appearing and disappearing. Because following the rule that from that which is one yet can only proceed another thing which is also one.
Yeah.
If we take the rule, somewhere we will have problem with explaining multiplicity.
Yeah.
The solution, which at least I grasped, it was with the constant motion of the heavenly spheres, which have the two aspects of constantness in one aspect and with eternal motion from other aspects. But it makes me to deep think more to think more deeply what it means when we say that the source of everything, that God or absolute being or whatever we can call it, is constant or it is simple. Uh, because yes, in some sense it is constant, simple, and so on, but it have a paradoxical nature because of this simplicity or oneness. It proceeds everything which is, let's say, changing or which is multiple and so on. And here something which helps me to some degree when we take the analogy of numbers. If we say that the number one, it is simple on one hand, but from him, he in some sense has the infinite potentiality from which every other numbers proceed from it. Here, would you, for example, with another symbols or examples or similitudes, can proceed to this paradoxical nature of simplicity of God? How on one side we say it is simple or one from every aspect, but on other sense or aspects, the multitude and the change of and everything else proceeds from him. I'm sorry if my question is very confused.
You formulate the question from this angle. We talk about three things in a hierarchy. There's God, there's the command, and then there's the creation. So hak, am, chalk, right? And then from this angle, you can very easily explain how from one proceeds one. So from one proceeds the command. You can call it the intellect, whatever term you want to use. And from the intellect proceeds the world, right? So from one proceeds one. And this one in the final, in the final hypothesis, which is the creation, is a multiplicity of them. So these are the wohad fil adad. These are the ones within them coming into being and passing out of existence. That changes nothing about the simplicity of God, nor does it, necessarily create a paradox in relation to God, because there's a midway hypothesis in between the ak and the kaf, which is the ak.
Okay. Thank you, Sidi.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay. Let's leave it here for this week. And for next week, we'll read the next two propositions. As always, if you have any questions, if the language is a little bit dense, let me know. There's a few people who aren't here, but I'm sure they're going to catch up on the video. And then we'll come back the same time next week and continue with our readings of Mulla Sadra. So everybody be well until next week. Yallah.